On April 29, 1945, the man who had once promised a 1,000-year Reich awoke beneath a ruined city that would not last another day. Above him, Berlin burned. Soviet artillery rolled like distant thunder through the concrete of the Reich Chancellery, shaking dust from light fixtures and loosening plaster from the bunker ceiling. In those last hours, the world he had built collapsed room by room, corridor by corridor, until all that remained was a narrow underground suite, a handful of loyalists, and a clock no one could stop. Shortly after midnight, Adolf Hitler sat awake in his private quarters, wrapped in a gray military coat too large for his shrunken frame. The man who had once paraded across Europe was now pale, stooped, and trembling. The walls around him hummed with the dull vibration of bombardment. Every boom from above made the light bulbs flicker. Dust drifted from the ceiling with each concussion, coating the floor like ash. The bunker was built for command, but it had become a tomb. The corridors were lined with stale air, the smell of oil, cigarette smoke, and mold. Typewriters clacked behind half-open doors as secretaries retyped orders to divisions that no longer existed. Maps in the Situation Room were weeks out of date. Entire units shown in blue pencil had been destroyed, yet Hitler refused to erase them. His aides had stopped correcting him. They nodded, wrote down his dictations, and waited for the inevitable. At 12:40 a.m., a strange summons broke the routine. SS Adjutant Otto Gunsche entered the small lounge and informed the staff that the Führer wished to conduct a marriage ceremony. The announcement drew silent stares. Eva Braun, who had been living in the bunker for months, almost invisible to the hierarchy, was finally to become Frau Hitler. She was 33. He was 56. They had shared 12 years of secrecy. The end of the world had brought their first public union. The witnesses gathered in the small conference room. Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann stood stiffly near the wall. Hitler's secretaries, Traudl Junge and Gerda Christian, waited by the door. The registrar, a minor city official named Walter Wagner, had been located above ground amid the ruins and escorted down. The ceremony was brief, almost surreal. Outside, the ground trembled from artillery. Inside, Wagner asked Hitler if he was of pure Aryan descent and free of hereditary disease, the standard Nazi marital oath. Hitler replied hoarsely, "Yes." He then asked Eva the same. "Ja," she answered, her voice light but clear. There were no rings. They exchanged small tokens that had survived the evacuation from the Chancellery. The marriage lasted less than 10 minutes. A handful of officers signed as witnesses. There was no applause. Only the metallic clatter of shell bursts overhead and the hum of the ventilation fans. When it was done, Hitler kissed her lightly on the lips, thanked Wagner, and returned to his study. Eva Braun glowed with a kind of tragic excitement. "Now I can die as Frau Hitler," she said softly to Junge. She opened a bottle of champagne and poured glasses for the secretaries, though few drank. The gesture felt like an act of defiance against the bunker's decay, a toast to a world already buried. By 2 a.m., the newly married couple moved into the map room, where Hitler dictated his last will and political testament. Junge took her place at the typewriter. Her fingers hovered over the keys as Hitler began to speak in a measured, almost bureaucratic tone. The text was part manifesto, part inventory, and part indictment. He blamed the war on international Jewry and denounced his generals for betrayal. He declared that his body should be burned after death, a final precaution against capture and humiliation. Then, shifting to the personal testament, he spoke of property, possessions, and the people who would inherit the ruins of his empire. He left small gifts to longtime aides and instructed that Eva Braun's family be treated kindly. The testament named Karl Donitz as president of the Reich, Joseph Goebbels as chancellor, and Bormann as party minister appointments that were meaningless by that hour. Outside the bunker walls, Donitz was in northern Germany, surrounded by collapsing lines. Goebbels and Bormann were trapped here with him, breathing the same recycled air. When he finished, he demanded that 3 copies be typed and signed immediately. Young's typewriter rattled through the early hours. Bormann applied the official seal, his signature curling in dark ink beside the Führer's shaky scrawl. Hitler's hand shook violently as he signed, his handwriting reduced to a trembling scratch. He inspected the papers, nodded once, and ordered that couriers carry them out through the city to reach the remaining command posts. The men chosen to deliver them, Major Wilhelm Zander, Heinz Lorenz, and Wilhelm Bergdorf, knew the odds were slim. One of them whispered that he would rather be shot than step into the inferno above. By 4 a.m., the corridors were filled with hurried footsteps as messengers prepared to leave. Outside the bunker, the last defenders of Berlin fought block by block. Soviet infantry were less than 2 kilometers away. Machine gun fire echoed through the subway tunnels. Flamethrowers roared in the ruins of the Chancellery gardens. The smell of smoke and cordite crept into the air shafts. Hitler, hearing the muffled roar of battle, asked how long the city could hold. His adjutant gave a practiced lie. "Perhaps 2 days, my Führer." Hitler nodded, knowing it was not true. He dismissed the room and asked to be alone with Eva. She brought him tea, knelt beside his chair, and rested her head on his arm. For the first time in days, witnesses said he looked calm, as if the final decision had already been made. In the adjoining hall, Goebbels argued with Bormann over the wording of the testament. Goebbels wanted to add a statement about heroic resistance. Bormann insisted it remain as dictated. Both men knew that within hours, these papers would be worthless artifacts of a vanished government. In the staff quarters, the younger secretaries tried to sleep, though sleep was nearly impossible. The ground shook constantly. Each impact sounded closer than the last. Above them, a city of 5 million people was dissolving into smoke and silence. Some wept quietly in their bunks, others whispered prayers. The ventilation fans clanked irregularly, pushing air thick with oil fumes and candle soot. At 5 a.m., Hitler called for his adjutants again. He asked for a situation report. The communications officer explained that Army Group Vistula had ceased to exist. The relief attack promised by General Wenck would never arrive. The nearest German units were scattered, some surrendering to the Soviets, others trying to reach the American lines. Hitler said nothing for a long time. Then, almost in a whisper, he murmured, "So, it is over." But routine persisted. Breakfast was served dry biscuits, tea, and a few canned vegetables. Hitler ate little. Eva Braun tried to smile, chatting about trivial things, but her voice trembled. Goebbels joined them briefly, reading out news from a pocket radio. The Soviets had taken Potsdamer Platz. Their shells were now landing less than 500 meters from the Chancellery. The entire city was collapsing inward, like a burning lung. Above ground, dawn revealed what was left of the Reich. The Brandenburg Gate stood headless, its columns shattered. Fires raged unchecked. Civilians wandered through the ruins carrying white cloths. In the Tiergarten, horses from the Berlin Zoo roamed freely, thin and wild-eyed. Beneath this devastation, the Führerbunker glowed with dim electric light and stubborn order. The telephone still rang, officers still saluted. Even at the end, the rituals continued. When Hitler passed through the hallway, guards straightened to attention. He barely noticed them. As the morning light filtered faintly through the bunker's periscope shafts, the clock above the map room showed 6 a.m. The first 6 hours of his final day were over. Hitler had sealed his marriage, written his testament, and heard the last honest report of the war. Outside, Soviet soldiers were already breaching the city's inner defenses. Inside, the Reich's last leader was preparing to die. By dawn, the war outside had become a soundscape of collapse, a continuous percussion of artillery that rolled through Berlin like an earthquake. Each detonation rattled dust from the concrete vaults of the Führerbunker, where stale electric light replaced the morning Sunday. Above ground, the Reich Chancellery was a skeleton. Windows blown out, ceilings torn open, walls carved by shell fire. But inside, at a long wooden table beneath humming lamps, the last government of the Third Reich still met as if it ruled something more than a few corridors of air. At 6:15 a.m., Hitler appeared in the Situation Room wearing his familiar gray tunic, though it now hung loosely from his frame. His hair, once slicked back with theatrical precision, was thin and matted. He moved stiffly, dragging his left leg, his right hand trembling with each step. Yet the staff rose to attention as he entered, as they always had. Habit survived even when faith had gone. The maps on the wall were ghostly relics. Thick blue grease pencil lines marked defensive fronts that had ceased to exist. The Soviet spearheads, marked in red, were no longer arrows but spreading stains covering the heart of Berlin. When the duty officer gave his report, the words fell into a silence that felt like a prayer. The Red Army was now less than a kilometer from the bunker. Shells were hitting Wilhelmstrasse. The Zooflak Tower was surrounded. The Ninth Army had been annihilated east of the city. Hitler listened without interruption, eyes fixed on the table. When the report ended, he asked in a low voice if Wenck's 12th Army was advancing from the west. General Bergdorf hesitated before answering. "They cannot reach us, my Führer. They have stopped near Potsdam." The reply was as gentle as possible, but the meaning was final. For a moment, Hitler said nothing. Then he waved a trembling hand and dismissed them. Those close enough to see his face later said that something seemed to dissolve in that instant. Not rage, not despair, but the last thin layer of denial that had kept him upright. He turned away and muttered, "Then everything is lost." The meeting broke apart. Goebbels returned to his quarters to draft yet another broadcast no one would hear. Bormann stalked the corridor, dictating impossible orders to a communications staff that no longer had any functioning lines. Secretaries hurried between rooms, carrying messages from a government that was now entirely imaginary. At 7, the air raid siren above the bunker wailed again. A series of shells struck the Chancellery gardens, shaking the structure so hard that plaster rained from the ceiling. In the dim light, Eva Braun appeared in the hallway, wearing a dark dress, her hair perfectly set as if for an afternoon stroll. She asked one of the guards if the bombing was close. "It's always close now, gnädige Frau," he answered with a tired smile. She nodded and returned to her room. There was an eerie domestic rhythm to the morning. Hitler asked for breakfast tea, dry biscuits, and a small portion of oatmeal. He ate mechanically, staring at nothing. When a secretary tried to refill his cup, he thanked her politely, almost gently, as if the war had already receded from his mind. Then, as if remembering protocol, he ordered that the remaining SS guards check the courtyard for any route still open toward the Brandenburg Gate. Outside, the garden had become a crater field. Burned trees leaned against the Chancellery walls. The statue of Germania lay in fragments among the rubble. A black cat, one of the few living things left on the surface, darted through the debris as the guards searched. They found nothing usable. The last access roads were blocked by collapsed masonry and Soviet machine gun nests. Escape was impossible. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere grew more unreal with every hour. The ventilation systems coughed under the dust. The walls dripped with condensation. The smell of smoke mixed with disinfectant, oil, and unwashed uniforms. Somewhere, a phonograph played quietly an old military march, distorted by echo. At 8 a.m., Hitler summoned his adjutants again. His tone had changed. He no longer spoke of counterattacks or secret weapons. Instead, he asked about the method of suicide. Heinrich Himmler, his longtime ally, had fled days earlier after attempting secret negotiations with the Allies, a betrayal Hitler had learned of only the day before. Now, he declared that he would not be handed over like a show animal as Mussolini had been. The reference to his Italian counterpart hung heavy in the air. The news of Mussolini's execution and public display in Milan had reached the bunker 2 days earlier, smuggled in through radio reports. Hitler had read the account twice, in silence, then said only, "That will never happen to me." He called for his personal physician, Dr. Werner Haase, to demonstrate the use of cyanide capsules. Haase placed one on the table, small, brown, glassy, and explained that it would bring death within seconds by shutting down the respiratory system. Hitler listened carefully, nodding, his fingers drumming the tabletop. He asked Haase to test it on Blondie, his beloved German shepherd, to confirm the poison's effectiveness. The order stunned even his loyal guards. They led the dog to a side room in the upper bunker, placed the capsule in her mouth, and closed her jaw. Within moments, she convulsed and went still. The soldiers stood frozen. When they reported back, Hitler merely nodded and dismissed them. For the first time, witnesses said, he looked visibly shaken not by the loss of his empire, but by the death of the only creature he had ever seemed to trust. Shortly afterward, Hitler emerged to inspect the animal's body. He ordered that Blondie's remains be wrapped and buried in the Chancellery garden. Then he turned to his staff and said, "I shall not fall into the hands of the enemy. My body is to be burned here." The tone was quiet, absolute. No one answered. By 9:30 a.m., the bunker had divided itself into rituals of waiting. Goebbels dictated a final letter to Admiral Dönitz, still unaware that Berlin had fallen. Bormann drafted coded messages instructing surviving party officials to continue the struggle by any means. Secretaries typed these orders on machines that clacked like tiny metronomes of futility. Every few minutes, someone checked the time, as if the war could be measured in quarter hours until extinction. Hitler's physical condition deteriorated rapidly. His complexion was waxen, his left eye twitching uncontrollably. He shuffled rather than walked, leaning on furniture for balance. Even those who had followed him for years avoided looking directly at him now. The myth of invincibility, the aura that had sustained a nation, had collapsed into a man unable to control his own hands. At 10 a.m., a messenger brought news that Soviet troops had entered the Moabit district and were closing on the Reichstag. The red flag was expected to be raised over the building within the day. Hitler reacted with a brief, violent outburst, slamming his fist onto the table. Then, just as suddenly, the anger drained from him. "Everything I built," he murmured, "will crumble with me." The rest of the morning unfolded in hushed fragments. Eva Braun distributed small keepsakes to the secretary's perfume bottles, brooches, scarves, as if preparing for a trip rather than a death. "Keep something to remember better days," she said, smiling faintly. Some took them out of pity. Others refused, unable to meet her eyes. In another room, Goebbels' children played quietly with a deck of cards under the care of their mother, Magda. The noise of the bombardment barely seemed to register to them anymore. It was simply the sound of their world. Their parents had already decided they would not survive their father's defeat. The staff knew it but said nothing. By 11 a.m., the Situation Room was deserted, except for a few officers hunched over telephones that no longer connected to anything. Hitler sat in his study again, dictating short notes that Bormann wrote down by hand, instructions to destroy remaining documents, orders to his guards about the disposal of his body, and one final letter to Field Marshal Keitel instructing continued resistance where possible. Each sentence ended with a pause, as though he already knew no one would read them. Above, the sky over Berlin was black with smoke. Soviet shells had set entire districts ablaze. The city's landmarks, the opera, the cathedral, the museums burned like pyres of the old empire. In the bunker, time crawled. Clocks ticked audibly through the muffled thud of explosions. The power flickered twice, then steadied. Hitler paced the corridor outside his room, his steps uneven, his breathing labored. He stopped once to pet one of Blondie's surviving puppies, murmuring something no one caught. At 11:45, he returned to the main dining area where his senior staff had gathered. The table was laid with the remnants of breakfast and a few tins of food. Hitler took a seat at the head and gestured for the others to eat. "Eat," he said quietly. "You'll need strength." It was not an order, but an echo of one. They ate in silence. The ceiling trembled again, showering grit onto their plates. Bormann poured a little wine into Hitler's glass. He didn't touch it. The only sound was the low hum of the ventilation and the faint, rhythmic pulse of artillery above. By 12 noon, the air in the bunker had grown heavy and metallic. The shelling outside was constant now, unbroken. The Red Army was less than 500 meters away. The last daylight of April 29 filtered faintly through a damaged air shaft, falling across the damp concrete floor. Hitler stood, adjusted his collar, and said simply, "That will be all for today." He turned toward his private quarters, Eva following silently behind. The door closed. The morning of the Reich's final day had ended. Outside, Soviet troops tightened the circle. Inside, history waited for afternoon. By noon on the 30th of April 1945, the last empire of Adolf Hitler existed within the dimensions of a bunker. Outside, the city that had once hosted 1,000 parades was being consumed by its own fire. Soviet soldiers were less than 300 meters from the Reich Chancellery, advancing through the ruins in small squads, bayonets fixed, throwing grenades into every cellar and hallway that could conceal resistance. Every explosion above ground sent a tremor through the walls below. Inside the Führer bunker, the electric lights flickered in time with the bombardment. The room smelled of sweat, fuel, and damp concrete. Somewhere, a kettle hissed on a hot plate. The faint rattle of typewriter keys carried down the corridor, the mechanical heartbeat of a regime already dead. At 12:10 p.m., Hitler emerged from his private quarters. His face was colorless. His left hand twitched against his thigh. He greeted those he passed with a nod that was more habit than acknowledgement. Eva Braun walked beside him, wearing a plain blue dress. Her hair was brushed and set perfectly, as if she were preparing for a dinner party rather than death. Together, they entered the small dining room for what would be their final meal. The table was simple: noodles, a small bowl of vegetable broth, and wine. Hitler, who remained a vegetarian, barely ate. Eva sipped wine and spoke softly about their early years in Munich, about the mountains, about the color of the sunsets above Berchtesgaden. Witnesses said that for a few minutes, she seemed almost serene, as though nostalgia could momentarily dissolve the bunker walls. Hitler listened without expression. He thanked her for her loyalty. She replied, "I will not leave you." At 12:45 p.m., SS Adjutant Otto Gunsche entered to announce that the situation outside had worsened. The Soviets were now at the Reichstag, and the upper floors of the Chancellery were collapsing under shell fire. Hitler nodded, as if confirming what he already knew. He dismissed Gunsche and returned to the table. "It is finished," he said quietly. Shortly thereafter, he summoned his two remaining secretaries, Trottel Junge and Gerda Christian, to the study. They found him calm, his voice steady but hollow. He thanked them for their service and urged them to try to escape while they still could. "You are young," he said. "Go and live." Both women began to cry. Eva, standing near the door, took Junge's hands and said, "Don't be sad, I am happy to die with him." The conversation was brief. The women were dismissed. As they left the study, they heard Hitler tell Gunsche to make certain that no remains would fall into enemy hands. "I want to be burned completely," he said. "Do you understand?" "Completely," Gunsche nodded. By 1 p.m., the bunker had entered its final rhythm. Brief, whispered orders, followed by long silences. Bormann drafted coded telegrams for transmission to Donitz in northern Germany, informing him that Hitler would soon be dead and that Donitz was to assume leadership of what remained of the Reich. The radio operator, hands trembling, tapped out the message through a fading signal. Each dot and dash echoed faintly against the concrete like a funeral toll. In another room, Joseph Goebbels prepared his own family for what was coming. His wife Magda gathered their 6 children, dressed them neatly, and led them in prayer. "Soon we will go to heaven," she told them. The staff heard none of this directly, only fragments, the sound of footsteps, a child's voice, a door closing. At 1:30 p.m., Hitler requested that cyanide capsules be brought to his study. They were contained in a small wooden box, identical to the one used to kill Blondie the day before. He opened it, inspected the glass ampules, and handed one to Eva. "Try not to suffer," he said quietly. She nodded and pocketed it. In the corridor outside, those who remained Bormann, Goebbels, Linge, Gunsche, and a handful of guards gathered without speaking. Each man understood what would follow, but none dared to mark the hour aloud. At 2 p.m., Hitler summoned his aides for a final farewell. The moment was strangely formal. He shook hands with each in turn. His grip was weak, but his gaze was direct. "Thank you," he said to Bormann. "Thank you," to Goebbels. To his guards, he gave a small nod of approval. "You have been loyal men." He turned to Linge and said, "You know what to do after." Linge answered, "Jawohl, mein Führer." Then, Hitler and Eva withdrew into his private quarters, the small room at the end of the corridor. Linge followed, then stopped at the threshold. Hitler turned once more and said, "Wait outside until it is done." The door closed softly behind him. The remaining witnesses stood in the hallway, silent. The bunker seemed to hold its breath. Minutes passed 5, 10, perhaps less. Then, at 2:30 p.m., a single gunshot cracked through the silence, flat and final. Those standing nearest the door heard it clearly. The smell of burnt powder seeped out almost immediately, followed by the faint, bitter scent of cyanide. Linge and Gunsche entered first. The sight was as expected. Eva Braun slumped on the sofa, a trace of blue around her lips. Hitler seated beside her, head tilted slightly forward, blood pooling on the carpet. The pistol, a 7.65 millimeters Walther, lay at his feet. The men stood for a moment, frozen. There were no words, no gestures, only the dull echo of the shot still ringing in their ears. Then, Linge stepped forward, wrapped the bodies in blankets, and called for assistance. Outside the room, Bormann removed his cap. Goebbels crossed himself, a rare, reflexive motion from a man who had long abandoned faith. Someone whispered, "It's over." No one replied. The rest was procedure. Gunsche organized the removal. The bodies were lifted carefully and carried up the narrow staircase to the bunker's emergency exit. Above them, the Chancellery garden was a wasteland of rubble, smoke, and shell craters. The air reeked of gasoline and wet earth. Soviet shells continued to fall nearby, shaking the ground as they moved. They laid the 2 bodies in a shallow depression beside the remains of a broken water tank, the same spot where Blondie had been buried the day before. Gunsche poured petrol from several jerry cans over the blankets until they glistened. He looked to Bormann, who nodded. Linge struck a match and tossed it onto the bodies. Flames rose immediately, feeding on the fuel. The fire twisted in the wind, throwing sparks across the ruins. For a moment, the men stood in silence, watching the figures burn. Then another shell burst nearby, and they scattered for cover. From the bunker doorway, Goebbels watched the smoke curl into the afternoon sky. The sound of battle never ceased: machine guns, grenades, the low rumble of tanks closing in. But beneath the noise, something else had shifted. For the first time in 12 years, there was no Führer to issue orders. At 3 p.m., the fire was still burning, though the bodies were blackened beyond recognition. Linge returned to the bunker and reported to the staff, "The Führer is dead." The words passed from mouth to mouth, room to room, until even the lowest guard at the outer door knew. Some men wept quietly. Others simply sat down, staring at the floor. In the radio room, the operator sent a coded message to Admiral Donitz. "The Führer is dead. Berlin will fall. The transmission was brief, ending with static. Goebbels, hearing the confirmation, turned to his wife. "Now we can go too," he said. Inside the bunker, the remaining air felt heavier, as if even the walls understood that their purpose was finished. The lights dimmed, flickered, and steadied again. The world outside roared closer. By 3:30 p.m., the fire above had begun to fade, leaving only smoke and the smell of fuel. The wind carried ashes across the garden, fragments of uniform cloth, hair, and burnt paper swirling into the April air. The men who had witnessed it retreated underground, sealing the door behind them. Below, silence returned to the corridors. The bunker had become a mausoleum. The man who had promised 1,000 years of empire had lasted 12, and the final act had taken less than 10 minutes. The afternoon was not yet over, but history had already changed course. By 3:45 p.m., the fire in the Reich Chancellery garden was still burning, the heat pushing waves of distortion through the smoke. The bodies of Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun had already begun to crumble under the flames, the petrol hissing as it met damp soil. Soviet shells landed sporadically around the compound, scattering dust and debris across what had once been the grand center of the Nazi state. The men who had set the fire, Otto Gunche, Martin Bormann, and a handful of guards crouched behind a low concrete wall, shielding their faces from the heat. They had no words, no ceremony, only the knowledge that the figure who had dominated Europe for over a decade was now a dark mass amid the ruins. They watched until the jerry cans were empty, until there was nothing left to pour, then turned away. The burning had not finished the job. The flames were too weak, the air too damp. Still, the point was not perfection, it was erasure. Hitler's body would not be displayed in a square, as Mussolini's had been. That was his final command, and his followers obeyed it with mechanical precision. When they returned underground, the bunker had changed. The air was thicker, quieter, as though the machinery of obsession had finally stopped. The echo of distant artillery still rolled through the corridors, but inside, the chatter of telephones and typewriters had ceased. It was the stillness of an emptied hive. At 4 p.m., the remaining senior officials assembled in the map room for what would be the last meeting of the Third Reich. Bormann, his face gray with exhaustion, read aloud the message confirming Hitler's death. "The Führer is dead," he said flatly, "but the struggle continues." The irony of the second phrase was not lost on anyone. There was no army left to continue anything. The Red Army was less than 100 meters from the building. Their shells shook dust from the ceiling as he spoke. Goebbels, pale and calm, broke the silence. "The Führer's word is final," he said. "Now it is our duty to follow him." He stood, adjusted his coat, and walked out without waiting for a reply. Down the hall, Magda Goebbels was preparing her 6 children for death. She had dressed them carefully, combed their hair, and given them each a piece of chocolate laced with a sleeping powder. They fell asleep quickly, their small chests rising and falling in unison. Then, with help from a doctor, she crushed cyanide capsules between their teeth one by one. When it was over, she smoothed their hair and sat beside them in silence. In another room, officers debated escape routes. The Soviet encirclement was nearly complete, but a few believed that, under cover of darkness, they could slip through the ruins toward the west. Bormann approved the plan. Goebbels refused to hear it. He returned to his office, wrote a short note, and at 8:30 p.m., he and Magda went up to the same garden where Hitler's body had burned. They stood together for a moment, side by side, the city glowing red around them. A pistol shot cracked. When the guards looked up, the propaganda minister and his wife were dead. Their bodies were doused with gasoline and set alight. As night deepened, the bunker filled with fumes, gasoline, smoke, and the sour smell of decay. The diesel generator coughed and sputtered. The air was almost unbreathable. People moved slowly, their faces streaked with sweat and grime. Every corridor echoed like a cave. Somewhere, a gramophone played a scratchy recording of Wagner's Götterdämmerung, Twilight of the Gods, looping through static. At 10 p.m., Bormann made preparations to leave. He gathered a few officers and guards who still believed they could reach the German lines. They armed themselves, packed rations, and checked their pistols. Before leaving, he gave the last recorded order in the Führer bunker: destroy everything. The men lit fires in the archive room, feeding them with documents, blueprints, and photographs. Paper burned fast, curling into ash that floated through the halls. The group moved toward the emergency exit. The ground above was a hell of smoke and fire, but the path to the Tiergarten lay open for a few minutes between bombardments. They stepped out into the ruins, into a world that no longer belonged to them. Inside, only a few remained: secretaries, medics, and the wounded. Traudl June sat at her desk, writing in her diary by candlelight. "The Führer is dead," she wrote. He lived in delusion to the end. Around her, the bunker groaned with each explosion. Dust drifted from the ceiling like snow. Someone prayed softly in the next room. Another man sat staring at a wall, whispering his own name as if trying to remember it. Shortly before midnight, Soviet soldiers breached the Chancellery compound. They moved cautiously, weapons raised, flashlights cutting through smoke. The garden was still smoldering. The charred remains near the water tank drew their attention immediately. The corpses were barely recognizable, blackened bone and fabric fused together, but they knew what they had found. Orders were shouted, photographs taken, samples collected. Below, in the bunker, the survivors heard footsteps above and knew it was over. Some tore off their insignia, others waited to be captured. No one resisted. At 12:30 a.m., May 1, 1945, the Soviet flag was raised above the Reich Chancellery. Berlin, the heart of the Reich, had fallen. The last war Hitler had unleashed, the war he had promised would make Germany eternal, ended in the ruins of his own capital, under the boots of the men he had sworn to destroy. The following days blurred into aftermath. Soviet investigators sifted through the wreckage, collecting fragments of skull and jawbone for identification. Allied intelligence officers would later confirm the evidence, though the world would argue over it for decades. Rumors spread that he had escaped, fled to Argentina, or vanished beneath the Alps. The truth lay in the ashes of the Chancellery garden, mixed with soil and rain. The bunker itself was sealed and later destroyed. Concrete collapsed inward, burying the rooms where the last government of the Reich had sat in silence. The garden was paved over, then turned into a parking lot. No monument marks the spot. The night of April 30 faded into a new May, dawn over a dead empire. The Soviets paraded through streets still burning, their soldiers writing names in chalk on the walls of the Reichstag. Ivan was here. April 1945. For those few who survived the bunker, memory became the only record. Traudl Jung, Otto Günsche, and others would tell their stories years later, describing the flicker of light on concrete walls, the smell of burning fuel, the sound of the last gunshot. But none could fully explain how a man who had commanded the world's fear ended his life in a room smaller than an office, surrounded not by armies but by silence. The Third Reich had begun with torchlight and banners, and it ended with gasoline and rags. What was left of Adolf Hitler was buried by strangers in a foreign garden, exhumed, destroyed again, and scattered to the river. The fire that night was both funeral and erasure, a brief, fierce glow marking the end of 12 years of war, tyranny, and delusion. In its smoke drifted the last illusions of a 1,000-year Reich that had lasted barely more than a decade. And when the fire went out, there was nothing left of the man, or the myth, or the empire he had promised would never die.